Chapter 1. By the time the good china glints and my father pours wine like celebration, I know dinner is a setup. A swollen envelope waits by my plate, and my mother casually speaks my exact bonus. A number only HR should know. I am Emily Carter, and later I will trace a 6:17 p.m. IT access, save the family text that mapped this calm ambush, and hit play on a recording where my brother admits the 42,000 is to plug gambling debt. But right now they think my signature is hours away. The pastor is queued, the bank slot is fixed, and a one-way ticket with my lawyer's number is zipped in my bag, which means I get to choose when this performance ends and whose story Ethan grows up hearing. I pulled up in front of my parents' house in Aurora on a Tuesday evening, surprised when my mother had insisted I come over for dinner. It was not anyone's birthday, not a holiday, not even a family anniversary. Still, she had sounded so firm on the phone that I set aside my usual gym routine and drove across town. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt something was off. The smell of roast beef filled the air, and the dining table was set with the china I had only seen on Christmas or Thanksgiving. A vase of fresh flowers stood at the center, their scent mixing with the heavy aroma of garlic mashed potatoes. My mother, Linda, wore her pearl earrings and a pale blue sweater, her hair done like she was going to church on Easter Sunday. My father, Robert, stood stiffly by the table in a navy blazer, as if a bank manager were coming over. I took off my coat and glanced around the living room. Everything gleamed, as if she had spent hours polishing. My brother Michael sat at the table already, hunched over his phone, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. His wife Jessica carefully sliced up food for their 9-year-old son Ethan, who was busy coloring a menu he had grabbed from some restaurant, oblivious to the tension in the room. I forced a smile and moved toward the table. Mum's voice was a little too high, a little too cheerful. "Isn't it nice, all of us together, on a weeknight?" I nodded, but did not answer. In my family, there was never a dinner like this without a purpose. I took my usual seat, the one at the corner near the window, the same chair where I had done high school homework, while Michael's trophies lined the cabinet. Dad filled my water glass, but avoided my eyes. Michael finally slid his phone aside and grinned at me, in that way he always did when he thought he had the upper hand. We passed dishes around. Mum placed a large portion of roast beef on Michael's plate and a smaller slice on mine. Ethan asked for ketchup, and Jessica gently reminded him that ketchup was not for special dinners. I smiled faintly, but inside my chest tightened. We had gone through maybe 10 minutes of small talk when the first clatter came. Mum set her fork down with too much force, her hand trembling only slightly. She folded her napkin, laid it carefully on her lap, and looked at me with an intensity that froze me in place. "Emily, we need to talk about something important." Dad reached under his chair and pulled out a thick envelope. He pushed it across the polished wood until it sat right in front of my plate. My hands hovered above it for a second before I finally opened it. The logo of First Mountain Credit Union stared back at me. I scanned the first page and felt the blood drain from my face. College fund loan agreement. Amount requested $80K. My name was already typed neatly into the cosigner line. Michael leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice casual but rehearsed. "It is just a formality. The bank wants someone responsible to back it up. You have steady credit." Responsible. That was the word they always used when they wanted me to clean up their mess. Mum's eyes glistened with what looked like ready-made tears. "Family helps family, and we know you can, sweetheart. You just received that nice bonus, 17,500, right?" I froze. The number hung in the air like a confession. No one outside my HR department should have known the exact figure. My hands clenched the paper as I tried to keep my breathing steady. Ethan looked up briefly, chewing on his bread roll, completely unaware that his college fund was being dangled like bait. My father leaned in, his voice stern, the same voice that had ordered me around my entire childhood. The interest is fair. This is for Ethan's future. I swallowed, my throat dry. I need some time to think about this. Michael's jaw tightened, his voice suddenly hard. The bank appointment is set for Thursday. Thursday. Just 2 days. My voice came out louder than I meant. Mum dabbed her eyes with her napkin. After everything we have done for you. I wanted to laugh. The kind of laugh that comes when pain and anger mix. What had they done for me? I had worked double shifts through college, taking on $60,000 in loans I had only recently paid off. Meanwhile, Michael had gotten a new truck for his 18th birthday and tuition covered without a second thought. I had clawed my way into stability, into a career at the pharmaceutical company downtown, and now they were circling me like vultures. "Excuse me," I whispered, pushing back from the table. I hurried down the hall, closed the bathroom door, and locked it. My hands gripped the cold sink. I splashed water on my face, trying to erase the heat rising in my cheeks. The mirror reflected my grandmother's eyes back at me. That steady look I remembered when she told me as a teenager that my life belonged to me first. I inhaled sharply and steadied my breathing. When I returned to the dining room, the envelope sat where I had left it. The conversation had died, everyone was waiting. Jessica shifted uncomfortably. Ethan tapped his fork in a small rhythm, and the adults stared at me like jurors waiting for a verdict. I set my napkin down, deliberately. I cannot sign this. The silence that followed was suffocating. Dad's jaw clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might crack. Mum's lips trembled before she pressed them into a straight line. Michael leaned back, crossing his arms with a dark scowl. Jessica avoided my eyes. For a long moment, the only sound was Ethan's fork tapping against porcelain. I could feel the heat of their stares pressing down on me, anger, disappointment, betrayal, all wrapped into one suffocating silence. I rose, took my coat from the back of the chair, and slipped it on slowly. The chandelier sparkled above us. The roast sat untouched. The china gleamed, but none of it mattered. The air was colder than winter. I felt their disappointment clinging to me like a heavy coat as I walked toward the door. That was the moment I understood there was no going back. The line had been drawn, and I was standing firmly on the other side of it. Chapter 2. I drove home that night in silence, the glow of the streetlights passing over my windshield as if they were spotlights marking each choice I had made. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and by the time I pulled into my apartment parking lot, my chest was pounding with the weight of years I had tried to bury. I sat in the car staring at the dashboard, and memories flooded in without permission. I was 15 again, standing in the gymnasium of Eastview High, with a blue ribbon in my hands. I had just won the state science fair, first place out of hundreds of students. My project had taken me months, late nights soldering wires and scribbling notes by the light of a small desk lamp. I looked into the audience, searching for my parents. The bleachers were filled with families clapping, proud mothers and fathers leaning over the rails to snap photos of their children. My spot was empty. I knew why. That same evening, Michael had a regional football game. My parents had chosen the stadium instead of the science fair. I remembered the text my mum had sent me, short and perfunctory. "Good luck, honey. Your brother needs us tonight." I stood there clutching the ribbon, with one hand and my cheap calculator in the other, while my teacher patted my shoulder. The applause echoed, but inside I felt hollow. Back in the present, I pressed my forehead to the steering wheel. That one moment had not been unique. It had been the pattern. Michael was the golden boy. He got the new truck at 18, shiny red, and parked proudly in our driveway. He had parties thrown for him, while I worked shifts at the grocery store bagging produce just to save for college applications. He was praised for touchdowns, for charm, for simply existing. I had been the reliable one, the one who stayed out of trouble, the one who was told to keep quiet, because my achievements would make others uncomfortable. When college came, my parents made a big show of supporting Michael's dream to attend a state university. His tuition was covered through their savings, his dorm stocked with brand new furniture and gadgets. For me, there was no college fund. I sat with financial aid officers, filling out forms until my wrist ached, signing for loans that stacked up into $60,000 before I even graduated. I worked part-time at the campus library, sometimes falling asleep over textbooks while Michael called to brag about his fraternity socials. I opened my closet and pulled out a shoebox from the top shelf. Inside was an old spiral notebook, the cover bent, the pages filled with cramped handwriting. My teenage journal. I flipped through, reading my own words written in shaky letters. They forgot again. No one came. Michael got another award, and Dad cheered louder than I have ever heard. I wonder if they even know what I do anymore. My chest tightened as I traced the ink with my finger. One page had a doodle of a house with me standing outside it, bags in my hands, smiling. Beneath it, I had scrawled, "One day I will leave and build my own life." I felt tears prick at my eyes. That promise had carried me through so many lonely nights. And yet, here I was years later, sitting in my apartment after my family had tried to ambush me into co-signing a massive loan I never agreed to. I set the notebook aside and walked into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "You are being selfish. Do you want Ethan to suffer?" I placed the phone face down on the counter, my jaw tightening. He had no idea how many sacrifices I had already made, how much debt I had carried alone while he coasted. I thought back to my graduation from the University of Colorado. My parents had shown up late, missing the ceremony, but arriving just in time for photos. They carried a bouquet of flowers that still had the grocery store price tag on it. They smiled, told me they were proud, then quickly left for Michael's barbecue, where dozens of his friends gathered. I celebrated that night with my roommate, eating cheap pizza and thinking about the loan bills that would start arriving in 6 months. I walked to the window, staring out at the streetlights flickering in the distance. Each memory sharpened my resolve. They had chosen again and again who mattered more. I had convinced myself that maybe someday I would be enough, that if I just worked harder, they would see me. But sitting at that dinner table, seeing my name already printed on that loan form, hearing my mother recite my exact bonus, I knew the truth. I was not their child in their eyes. I was their safety net, their backup plan, the one who never said no. I clenched my fists at my sides. I thought of Grandma Helen, who once held my hands after a fight with Mum and whispered, "Do not let them use you up. You only get one life." I could almost hear her voice now, clear and firm. The memories weighed heavy, but instead of breaking me, they lit a fire. I returned to the closet, slid the notebook back into the box, and pushed it firmly onto the shelf. I shut the door with more force than necessary. My pulse was steady now, my breaths deeper. No matter how much guilt they tried to pour on me, no matter how many times they called me selfish, I would not bend. I had carried myself through school, through debt, through years of being ignored, and I was stronger for it. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands, remembering all the hours they had spent typing essays, stacking shelves, balancing calculators. These hands had built a life from nothing. I would not let them be shackled to someone else's mistakes. This time I whispered aloud, almost daring the walls to hear me. Never again. They will not use me like this. Not this time. Not ever. The room felt heavier after I said it, but also clearer, as if a fog had finally lifted. I lay back on the bed, my eyes tracing the lines of the ceiling. Sleep would not come easily, but resolve had already rooted deep inside me. The past had written itself in scars and notebooks, but the future was mine to protect. Chapter 3. The next morning, I walked into the office downtown, and the fluorescent lights felt harsher than usual. I sat at my desk, booted up my computer, and opened the benefits portal to check my pay stub. My coffee sat untouched. As the screen loaded, something caught my eye. On the dashboard, a log history appeared at the bottom of the page, showing a record every access. My eyes froze on the entry from Tuesday at 6:17 p.m. while I was still driving to my parents' house for dinner. The IP address listed was not mine, and the device did not match anything I owned. I leaned closer to the monitor, my stomach twisting. Someone had been inside my account hours before that ambush dinner. I scrolled down further and saw the page accessed was my bonus payout detail. The exact number my mother had spoken aloud at the table, 17,500, was displayed on the screen. My hands grew cold. I pushed back from my desk and walked quickly to the accounting office. Sylvia Chang, the senior accountant, was pouring herself tea. She looked up and smiled faintly. "Morning, Emily. You look pale." I lowered my voice. "Sylvia, quick question. Who in IT handles benefit portal security?" She blinked, thinking. "That would be Lisa Moore. You know her, right? Her mum and your mum are friends from church." The words hit me like a stone. I forced a tight smile, thanked her, and walked back to my cubicle. My pulse raced as puzzle pieces slammed together in my mind. Lisa had access. My mum and Lisa's mum were close. My bonus amount was leaked before the dinner. It was no coincidence. I pulled up my email and sent a note to HR asking for a quick meeting. Within minutes, Janet Lopez, our HR manager, appeared at my desk. She motioned for me to follow her to a small conference room. "What is going on, Emily?" she asked once the door was closed. I showed her the portal log on my laptop. This was not me. Someone accessed my account Tuesday evening. Janet's brow furrowed. "We will run a trace. If it came through an internal account, we can identify who. That is a breach of confidentiality." Her calm tone steadied me slightly, but my chest still felt tight. I nodded, closing the laptop. "Thank you. I need this documented." She assured me she would start the process and keep me informed. As I left the room, I nearly bumped into Margaret Hill, my mentor from the research division. She had a way of noticing stress before anyone else. "You are walking like you are carrying bricks," she said gently. I swallowed, debating whether to speak. Finally, I told her, in a low voice, "Someone accessed my bonus details before my parents cornered me last night." Her eyes sharpened. "That explains the look on your face this morning. Listen to me. Document everything. Every log, every conversation, every detail. Keep a record outside of the company too. People who use family ties to steal from you will not stop if you stay silent." Her words steadied my resolve. I nodded, feeling both angry and grateful. Back at my desk, I opened a fresh folder on my personal drive and began saving copies of the portal log. I wrote down times, dates, and who I had spoken to. My phone buzzed with a new message from Michael. "You are making this harder than it needs to be. Sign the paper and stop being dramatic." I stared at the screen until the letters blurred, then placed the phone face down. My mind replayed the moment at dinner, when Dad tapped the paper, and Mum looked at me with tearful eyes. It had not been spur of the moment. It had been calculated, precise, and orchestrated. They had known exactly how much money I had. They had even recruited outsiders to confirm it. The thought made my skin crawl. I turned back to the computer, my fingers tightening on the mouse. This was not simply family pressure. This was intrusion. They had crossed a line and now I had proof. The office hummed around me, co-workers chatting about weekend plans, printers running, phones ringing. To me it felt distant, muffled, like I was moving underwater. I kept typing notes, each word solidifying the understanding that the dinner had never been about Ethan's future. It had been a trap crafted weeks in advance. When I finally leaned back in my chair, the city outside the window glowed under a cold winter sun. The streets of Denver moved on, cars rushing, people heading to lunch, but inside me something had shifted again. This was not just about saying no. It was about recognizing the depth of their manipulation. I shut my notebook with a firm snap and slid it into my bag. The plan at the dinner had not been spontaneous or born out of desperation. It was a scheme prepared carefully, designed to corner me with no escape. That realization sat heavy but also gave me clarity. If they had prepared so carefully, then so would I. Chapter 4. That Sunday morning, I slipped into the back pew of First Baptist Church of Aurora, hoping to avoid attention. The choir had just finished a hymn, and Pastor Williams stepped to the pulpit. He looked out over the congregation with his usual solemn expression. But when his eyes swept across the rows, I caught the briefest glance toward my parents. My chest tightened. He began to speak about duty and sacrifice, his voice carrying through the vaulted ceiling. He said that family is our first ministry, and those who turn their backs on loved ones turn their backs on God. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the sanctuary. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, making sure people saw. I sat frozen, feeling heat creep up my neck, every word striking like a hammer. After the service, the congregation gathered in the fellowship hall for coffee and pastries. I tried to slip out quietly, but Uncle Roger intercepted me by the cookie table. He gripped my shoulder in that too-tight way of his and said, "I heard there has been some tension. You know Ethan is bright. Imagine what he could do with proper support." Before I could answer, Aunt Cheryl appeared on my other side, her perfume overwhelming. She leaned close and whispered, "It would be such a shame if his opportunities were limited because of pride." I forced a stiff smile and said nothing. My hands shook as I poured coffee into a styrofoam cup, the liquid sloshing over the rim. People glanced at me with polite smiles that felt sharp as knives. I excused myself quickly and walked outside into the cold January air, gulping it like water. The next afternoon, I stopped at Safeway to pick up groceries. In the produce aisle, Mrs. Peterson, who had known me since kindergarten, eyed my cart. Her voice carried louder than necessary. "Some people remember where they came from," she said, looking straight at me. "And some people forget." Shoppers nearby turned their heads. My face burned as I picked up my bag of apples and walked away without a word. When I left the store, I drove past the church bulletin board that sat on the corner of Maple and 8th Street. A fresh message had been posted in bold black letters on the white background. "Pray for selfish daughters." I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. My chest ached with the weight of humiliation, anger pressing hard against my ribs. They had spread the narrative beyond the dinner table, beyond the family circle, into the whole community. Now even strangers would look at me and see only the story my parents wanted them to believe. I parked in front of my apartment and sat in silence. My phone buzzed again, with messages from my mother, short lines about duty and sacrifice and how Ethan would remember who helped him and who refused. I shut the phone off and tossed it onto the couch. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I paced the living room, fists tight, teeth clenched. Every corner of my life had been invaded: church, community, even the grocery store. They had built a cage around me, using guilt and reputation. I wanted to scream, to storm back into their house and demand they stop. But instead I stood still, pressing my palms against the wall to ground myself. The anger simmered under my skin, but I forced it down, breathing deep. They wanted me rattled. They wanted me desperate enough to cave. Instead, I would let their words fuel me. I walked to my desk, opened my notebook, and wrote down everything that had happened that day. Pastor's sermon, Roger's hand on my shoulder, Cheryl's whisper, Mrs. Peterson's comment, the bulletin board message. I underlined each one, proof, evidence. I closed the notebook, placed it carefully beside the growing folder of documents from work, and sat back. My hands still shook, but my mind was sharp. They had expanded their tactics, and I would expand mine. The apartment lights cast long shadows across the floor. I sank into the chair, heart pounding, but I stayed silent. I knew the fight was just beginning, and the more they pushed, the more determined I became to hold my ground. Chapter 5. Monday started with the low buzz of the elevators and a smell of burnt coffee that clung to the lobby. I badged in, kept my head down, and told myself to breathe in slow counts. At my desk, the red light on the phone was already blinking. The first voicemail was from reception. A caller who introduced himself as my brother had demanded to be transferred and asked if I was mentally stable enough to handle a family crisis. The receptionist had refused. My skin went cold, while my hands stayed steady on the keyboard. A second message played. My mother said I had sounded unwell and urged me to call before I did something I would regret. I deleted it and stared at the wall until a Teams banner slid across my screen. Janet, from HR, requested a check-in at 9:30 in Conference B. I looked at the time, looked at my reflection in the black monitor, and made myself sit taller. I gathered my binder with the portal access printouts and walked to the meeting. Conference B was windowless and quiet. Janet had a notepad ready and that careful, neutral tone that HR professionals learn to hold. She said the company had received multiple calls that morning, including one from a man who identified himself as my brother. He had used language that raised flags and suggested I might be erratic. She asked if I was safe and able to perform my work. I answered yes to both. I said my family was attempting to pressure me into co-signing a private loan and had escalated to workplace contact. I asked that all calls be documented as harassment. Janet ran through the standard wellness questions and offered the employee assistance program. I said I would consider counseling for my own support, but that there was no medical information to release and that I would not consent to any disclosure. She noted my request and said she would instruct reception not to transfer family members. If anyone showed up in the lobby, security would contact HR first. She also said IT security was tracing the benefits portal access from last week. If the access came from an internal account, the company would find the source. I asked for a copy of any call logs that were tied to my name. Janet said a redacted version could be shared after legal review. I thanked her and added that the same people calling the company were likely connected to the privacy breach. She wrote that down and promised updates. When I stepped into the hallway, I felt wrung out and oddly clearer. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, like a low warning. Margaret spotted me near the stairwell. She asked me to walk with her and led me up one flight where echoes swallowed stray sounds. I told her about the calls and the meeting. She listened with her arms folded loosely and a look that mixed irritation and calm. She said this was a classic power move meant to smear me at the office. She told me to document every voicemail, every text, every witness. If a caller threatened to come to the building, I should notify security and then her. She added that people who escalate like this are not certain. They are afraid of what I know. Back at my desk, I opened a file labeled Incident Log and typed the date and time of each contact. I exported the phone records, saved the audio files, and sent a summary to Janet with the portal screenshots. The phone rang again, with an unknown local number. I let it roll to voicemail. An email from reception arrived seconds later. The caller had identified himself as Michael and said he would come down to the office if he was not transferred. The word "come down" pulsed in my vision. I breathed through my nose until the rush in my ears settled. I left the building for lunch because Margaret had told me to step away from the blinking lights. A small cafe on Curtis offered quiet and heat. My hands wrapped around a paper cup and finally stopped shaking. My phone buzzed. A text from Michael said I was playing the victim and that a responsible adult would sign on Thursday. I stared at the message until the words thinned into lines. In the corner, a mother laughed as her toddler mashed banana into a napkin. I felt a sharp ache for Ethan and an even sharper anger at the way his name was being used as a lever. I texted Rachel and asked for a civil attorney who handled harassment and privacy. She replied with a name and said she would share my number. A few minutes later, an email arrived from a law office that matched the name. They offered a consultation on Tuesday at 4:30 or Wednesday morning at 9. I chose Tuesday and typed a short summary of the situation. Harassing calls to employer, possible improper access to benefits portal, family pressure to co-sign a loan, request to preserve evidence. I hit send and felt a small piece of ground return under my feet. When I came back from lunch, there was a note from Janet. Security had been briefed. Reception had instructions. It was tracing the access and would report when the source account was identified. She asked me to check in if any contact felt threatening. I thanked her and returned to a data validation task that demanded focus. Numbers calmed me. If a variable was out of range, you fixed it. If a record was corrupt, you flagged it. There was a method. With family, the inputs were always sabotaged. Near 2, my desk phone rang with a soft chime. A man introduced himself as Pastor Williams and said he could provide spiritual context to my employer if helpful. His tone was smooth, almost paternal. I said the company did not rely on religious input for policy and ended the call. I logged the number and forwarded it to HR with a note that community contacts were now reaching the workplace. A few minutes later, reception forwarded another voicemail. The caller had said there would be consequences for Ethan if I did not cooperate. I felt my throat tighten at the cruelty of that sentence. I wrote it down word for word and sent it to Janet, labeling it as intimidation linked to a minor. My director stopped by around 3. He said he had been briefed and that my performance record spoke for itself. He told me to direct any unusual contact to HR and keep my head on deliverables. The steadiness in his tone worked on my breathing like medicine. I finished the compliance memo, sent 2 vendor reviews, and backed up my incident log to a personal drive. Each saved file felt like a brick added to a wall I needed. As the afternoon thinned, the building exhaled into early evening quiet. I gathered my binder, notebook, and a flash drive with exports, then paused at the window. The sky over Denver had turned pale steel, and the freeway carved a bright ribbon toward the suburbs. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from a familiar community voice wishing that I would find humility. I saved it to the log without listening twice. "Keep everything," Margaret had said, so I would. On my way out, I stopped by her office and told her my plan in simple steps. I had scheduled a consultation with outside counsel. I would send the incident timeline, the call summaries, the portal logs, and any witness notes. I would follow legal instructions for preserving evidence and request letters to protect my workplace from further interference. She nodded, satisfied, and said I was doing exactly what needed to be done. The elevator hummed. The lobby was almost empty. In the glass, I saw a woman whose jaw was set and whose spine had found its length again. Outside, the air bit clean across my cheeks. I sat in my car with my hands on the wheel until the tremor left them, then opened my email and drafted one more message to the attorney with a concise timeline that began at the dinner table. When I pressed send, the small sound in my outbox felt louder than any of the calls that had tried to rattle me. The legal path had opened, and I stepped onto it with both feet. Chapter 6. I left the office a few minutes early on Tuesday so I could clear security at the building on 17th before the afternoon rush. The law firm lobby was quiet and smelled faintly of lemon polish. A receptionist with a neat bun took my name and asked me to wait by the window. The city looked washed in silver light, and my reflection stared back at me with a face I barely recognized, calm and tired and ready. David Morales opened the door to a small conference room and waved me in. He had a legal pad, a pen that clicked softly in his hand, and the kind of direct gaze that makes people slow down. He asked for a summary. I laid out the dinner, the envelope from the credit union, the exact bonus number spoken at the table, the portal access log, the church gossip, the calls to HR, the threat about Ethan's future. I slid a folder across the table with my incident log, screenshots, timestamps, and a copy of the voicemail transcriptions. He turned each page slowly and asked short questions that made the path straighter. He said the first priority was to stop the workplace interference. He would draft a letter to my family members who had called, and to any community members who tried to inject themselves into my employment. The letter would instruct them to cease and desist from contacting my employer, reception, or any company line. It would state that continued contact would be treated as harassment, and that any defamatory statements about my mental stability would open them to civil claims. He asked for the numbers that had called and the names attached. I pointed to the list I had typed. He nodded and wrote each one down. He said the second priority was the attempted loan. He explained that a CO signer on a $42,000 note becomes fully responsible if the primary borrower defaults. Late payments would show on my credit history and could sit there for 7 years or longer. The balance could be collected from me if the borrower failed to pay. The bank could pursue me in parallel without exhausting remedies against my brother. He said if I had any hesitation, then the answer was no, because a reluctant CO signer is a future defendant. I felt the chair catch the weight of my shoulders as the words settled. He recommended sending a notice to the credit union that no one was authorized to open accounts in my name or add my name to any instrument. He said we could also place a fraud alert on my credit files with the major bureaus to add friction if anyone attempted a pull. He asked about the portal access and whether IT had confirmed whose account touched my record. I told him tracing was in progress. He said if the access came through an internal login, then the company would have an obligation to contain the breach. He said we would send a preservation request to the company council, asking them to retain access logs, emails, and any communications related to my account. He wrote the phrase litigation hold in clean block letters. He also suggested I continue storing copies of anything routed to me and to keep a contemporaneous timeline. He said judges like timelines. He asked about recording calls. I told him I had not recorded my family. He said Colorado is a one-party consent state for recording private conversations. That meant I could lawfully record calls that I am a party to without telling the other person. He recommended that I do so if contact continued. Keep the recordings in the evidence folder, he said. Title each file with the date and time, transcribe the words that matter. He asked whether I felt physically safe. I paused. I said I did not believe Michael would show up at my apartment, but he had threatened to come to my office. He said if anyone appeared at the building, I should call security first, and then HR, and to remain in a public area. If threats escalated, we could seek a protection order. He did not dramatize it. He just placed it on the table like a tool I might need and could pick up later. He asked if I wanted him to call my mother or my brother. I shook my head. He smiled without judgment and said the letter would speak for me. He said the tone would be firm and factual, without heat. He said angry letters satisfy the writer, but clean letters move results. I believed him. He outlined next steps. He would email a draft of the cease and desist for my review that evening. He would prepare a template notice to the credit union stating that my signature was not authorized on any application and that any document bearing my name without a notarized presence was fraudulent. He would provide language for me to place a fraud alert and a credit freeze if I chose. He would send a preservation letter to my company's counsel, asking them to retain logs and to limit access to my file while the trace concluded. Finally, he would prepare a short script I could read if I needed to end a call. I do not consent to this contact. Future calls will be recorded and forwarded to counsel. Please direct all communication to my attorney. He said practicing the script now would make it easier to speak later, when adrenaline spiked. I asked about cost. He answered plainly. He said we could keep fees contained if I gathered and organized records the way I already had. He said my preparation had saved 2 hours today alone. He suggested one more act that would cost nothing. Stop explaining myself to anyone who is not acting in good faith. He wrote those words in the margin and underlined them once. At the end, he asked if I had any questions. I asked what happens if the credit union tries to push the appointment ahead of the letter. He said if they call me, I should read the script and hang up. If they call the house, I should not engage. The letter to the bank would go out tonight, by email and by certified mail tomorrow. He would copy me. He asked if I consented to his contacting HR to coordinate on documentation. I said yes. He stood and offered to walk me to the elevator. In the hallway, I felt a steadiness that had not been present for days. My hands were not shaking. My breath was even. We paused by the glass door, and he said one more thing. People who rely on guilt are surprised when guilt stops working. Expect noise. Do not mistake it for power. Outside, the evening had cooled into a clear blue, and the street lamps were clicking on one by one. I sat in my car and pulled out my phone. An email from his office landed in my inbox with a subject line that matched the legal pad. Draft letter for review. Attached were 3 documents. A letter to my family members and to Pastor Williams. A notice to First Mountain Credit Union. A preservation request to company counsel. I skimmed the language. Calm. Precise. No adjectives that did not belong. At home, I placed the new documents in my binder. Behind a tab, I labeled Counsel. I opened my laptop and set up fraud alerts with the 3 major bureaus. The forms were tedious and repetitive, but the confirmations arrived in my inbox within minutes. I printed them and slid them into sheet protectors. I practiced the phone script aloud with my kitchen timer ticking. The words felt awkward at first, then less so. I recorded my voice once and winced at the tremor I could still hear. I tried again until the tremor smoothed. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Jessica asked if we could talk. I stared for a long moment and then powered the phone off. Not tonight. Not before the letters were sent, and the line held. I washed a plate, dried it, and set it in the rack. The apartment felt quieter than it had in days. On the table, the binder looked heavier. as if the spine had grown. I sat and wrote the date at the top of my timeline and added a final line in neat block letters. Counsel retained. Letters in draft. Evidence preserved. Then I closed the cover and rested both palms on it until my heartbeat matched the rhythm of the table beneath my hands. Chapter 7. Morning light slid across the blinds and onto my binder, and I watched it catch on the tab that said counsel while my phone lay face down on the table. When I powered it on, a stack of messages rushed in. Jessica had written late at night asking to talk, then again saying she had information I needed. I told her to meet me after work at the small park off Havana. She was already there on a bench, hunched in a grey sweater, hair knotted as if she had been pulling at it. She did not move to hug me. She spoke quietly and got straight to it. Michael had been taking cash advances and running up 2 cards, and he was missing minimums. She had seen a gambling app on his phone, the kind that lights up red when a bet settles. She dug in her tote and handed me an envelope. Inside were copies of 2 statements with balances circled. One read $12,900 on a limit of $13,500 with a late fee posted. The other showed $9,800 on a $10,000 limit with a recent cash advance. My stomach turned as I held the paper. Jessica said the number 42,000 had nothing to do with a college fund. Michael had told her it would wipe the cards, pay off a short-term personal loan he had hidden from her, and leave a cushion so that a pretend savings account for Ethan could be waved around later if anyone asked. She said Linda knew about the debt and had said they would not touch their retirement. Jessica lowered her eyes and said my mother had told her that I was the sensible one and that sensible daughters step in. I pressed my thumb into the page until I left a dent. I asked how long she had known. She said weeks. She said she had asked him to tell me the truth, and he had told her to stay out of it. She looked exhausted and ashamed. She said there was more. She pulled up a photo on her phone and handed it to me. I recognized the laminate of my parents' kitchen counter. At the top of the page in the photo was the logo of First Mountain Credit Union, and the title was Traditional IRA. The balance line read $120,347.26. A yellow sticky note sat half on the page, with my mother's handwriting that said nest egg underlined twice. I stared until the numbers blurred. I asked when she had taken the photo. She said 3 days before the dinner. She said Linda had left the statement out and had laughed and said, "We will not touch this no matter what Michael did. That is why we have Emily." The bench felt unsteady for a second, though I knew it was still. The air in my chest went hot and then cold. They had money, not endless money, but enough to help if they cared to put skin in their own game. They had still chosen to reach for me first. Jessica said she had printed the images for me, and they were inside the envelope. She said she was sorry for adding pressure last week, and that she could not keep pretending. She asked me not to put Ethan in the middle, and I told her I never would. She said she might stay with her sister for a bit. I told her I had retained counsel and that letters were already in motion to stop the calls to my workplace. She nodded, as if she had guessed, and said my voice sounded different. She walked to her car without looking back, shoulders squared, like she had finally set something down. At home, I laid the envelope on the table and lifted the pages. The card statements were from 2 banks, with names and addresses clear, balances in tight font, due dates, late fees, and cash advances listed with times. One at an ATM near the bars on Colfax, one at a gas station close to their house. The IRA statement sat there with its total like a stone that refused to move. I dated each page and wrote the source on sticky notes. I photographed everything and saved high-resolution copies into my evidence folder with timestamps. Then I emailed David Morales, new documents from family member, evidence of debt and retirement account, request advice on retention and use. I printed my running timeline and added a section called Financial Documents. I listed the 2 card balances, the IRA total, and the dinner date. I wrote a single line that made my jaw lock. Requested amount equals debts plus a cushion for appearances. I underlined appearances and felt a tremor rush through my hands. I ran cold water over my wrists and waited until the shake dulled. The building murmured in its evening way. Pipes ticked. A neighbor laughed through the wall. A dog barked twice. My email pinged. David thanked me for the material, told me to keep both paper and digital copies, and asked for the metadata from the photos if I had it. He said the IRA number would matter if my parents later claimed inability to help, and that the card balances would be relevant if Michael continued to claim the loan was for a minor child. He said he would incorporate the figures into the letters and asked whether I wanted the bank notice expedited to same-day delivery. I replied yes and attached the image files and a short list of where and when the photos had been taken. I pulled my small fire safe from the closet, slid the printed statements into a folder labeled Carter Household Financials, and locked the safe. I rested my palm on the metal until the cool steadied me. Then I opened my old journal and wrote neat, even lines. Today I saw proof. The story at the table was a script. The numbers are the truth. They will protect their nest egg and spend my future. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Linda had called and asked whether she had gotten through to me. Jessica had said she had not. She told me she did not want to keep lying and might tell the truth if asked again. I told her to do what kept her safe and that I would manage whatever followed. Another text arrived from Michael a minute later, and I did not open it. I dropped the phone face down on the table and listened to my own breath steady. I logged into the 3 credit bureaus and verified that the fraud alerts I had placed were active. I wrote down the case numbers, printed confirmations, and slid them into sheet protectors. I checked my bank for unfamiliar pulls and set alerts for new inquiries. I exported a fresh copy of my incident log and saved it to an external drive. Every action felt like another brick placed into a wall I should have built years ago. The sun slid low and painted a thin ribbon of light across the floor. I stood at the window and watched it fade off the roofs across the street. It felt like watching a line being drawn in the air. On one side was the story my family wanted the town to believe, tidy and pious, about a daughter who would not help. On the other side was a stack of documents that refused to lie. Most people would never see those numbers. They would only hear a sermon and a rumor. I had the papers now. I closed the blinds, carried the binder to the table, and added a new tab. Financial evidence. I slid the pages in and snapped the ring shut. Shock shifted into something steadier than rage, a clean heat that could power a plan without burning it. The shape of the next move hovered just outside words, and I let it sit there. I turned off the kitchen light and carried the binder to the bedroom. The weight in my hands did not feel like a burden. It felt like a grip. I had finally chosen. Chapter 8. I spent the next morning at my desk with a focus that felt like a thin beam of light, cutting through noise. During a quick break, I opened the internal mobility portal and completed the transfer application for the analytics role in San Francisco that I had bookmarked months earlier. The form asked for reasons and availability. I wrote that my skill set matched their compliance needs and that I could begin within 3 weeks with remote support before arrival. I attached my last 2 performance reviews and a brief note from Margaret that highlighted my work on adherence modeling. I read the form twice and pressed submit. The confirmation page appeared, and my hands were steady. By noon, an internal recruiter called and asked for a short conversation. I stepped into a small room and kept my voice even. He said the California team needed someone who could step into audits quickly. He asked for my timeline and whether my manager would support a rapid handoff. I told him yes, and that I had already begun documenting my workflows. He said he would speak with my director and HR that afternoon. 20 minutes later, my director stopped by my desk and said he had given full support for the move if I wanted it. A soft shift moved through my chest, like a door easing open. Late in the day, the recruiter sent a transfer offer with a start date 2 Mondays away. The package included a relocation stipend and 2 weeks of corporate housing near the Embarcadero. My eyes lingered on the words start date, and I felt the ground tilt in the best way. I signed and returned the packet before doubt could gather. Then I opened a browser and searched flights from Denver to San Francisco for the evening before the bank appointment my family had set. I chose a late departure and purchased a refundable ticket with my own card. The confirmation chime sounded louder than it should. That night, I opened an account at a Bay Area credit union using online enrollment. I created long passwords and turned on 2-factor authentication. I linked my current checking account and set 2 transfers that would move my savings and my bonus the next business day. I left a small balance to keep the Denver account alive until I could change the bill payments. I added alerts for new inquiries and large transactions. I printed the confirmations and slid them into sheet protectors behind the tab that said financial evidence. I filed a mail forward request with the Postal Service to a mailbox service in San Francisco and confirmed the start date. I updated my employee record to the corporate housing address for the first 2 weeks. I texted Rachel and asked if she could drive me to the airport on the night of my flight. She replied that she would be outside my building with coffee and her car already warmed. The relief that ran through me felt like a safe hand on my back. On Wednesday, a plain envelope sat in my mailbox with my name printed in block letters and no return address. Inside was a single sheet with words in black marker, "Ungrateful daughters burn in hell." The postmark was from a suburb to the north. My hands trembled for one breath and then went still. I photographed the letter from front to back and captured the postmark. I logged the time and location in my incident file and sent the photos to David Morales. His reply arrived within the hour. Keep the original. Bring it to the next meeting. Do not respond. I slid the page into a clear sleeve and placed it in my safe. The soft click of the door sounded like a boundary closing. The calls from Michael did not stop. They changed shape. He left one message that sounded like pleading and another that leaned into threat. One said I was breaking the family. Another said the bank would not wait and that if Ethan suffered, it would be on me. I let each call move to voicemail. I recorded the incoming numbers with my phone log export and saved the files. When he finally reached me between meetings and spoke in a low, heated voice, I read the script David had given me. I said I did not consent to this contact, that future calls would be recorded and forwarded to counsel, and that he should direct all communication to my attorney. He spat a string of words I had not heard since we were teenagers and hung up. I wrote the time in my notebook and felt my pulse steady rather than race. That evening, I packed the first suitcase with clothes that could go from office to dinner, folded into tight stacks with care that felt ceremonial. I placed my binder flat on top and taped the rings closed so the pages would not scatter. My passport and social card went into a small pouch inside the inner pocket. I set the suitcase by the door and walked the apartment room by room with a list in my hand. Lease notice, utilities, internet equipment, gym membership. I scheduled a morning meeting with the property manager and drafted a brief note stating I would be relocating for work and would follow the lease break terms. I booked a cleaning service and posted 2 pieces of furniture for local pickup. Leaving turned into a quiet rhythm of small motions. The next morning, the recruiter sent a welcome packet from the San Francisco team with a schedule for day 1 and a contact in onboarding. HR confirmed the transfer and shared a draft of the internal announcement that would go out the following week. I read the line, thanking me for my work in Denver, and had to blink twice. Margaret stopped by my desk with a small plant and a smile that kept its shape. She said she would miss our hallway talks and that she was proud of how I had held the line. I told her I owed her more than I could say. She told me I owed myself the most. Around noon, a voicemail came from an unfamiliar number. The voice was measured and deep. It said that if I cared about Ethan, I would think twice before making his life harder. It referenced the bank appointment day as if it were a countdown. I saved the file and forwarded it to HR and to David, with a note that this felt like intimidation through a child. Janet replied that security had instructions to keep any caller out of employee areas and to alert building management at once. I bought a second ticket for the same flight in case I needed to adjust the booking at the last minute. I printed both confirmations and tucked them into my bag with the boarding pass. I messaged Rachel the exact time to meet outside and pinned the message so I would not fumble later. I picked up a small combination lock for the suitcase and watched the receipt arrive in my inbox. Another small proof that the plan had become a series of verifiable steps. That evening, the building intercom buzzed and then went silent. I stood still in the hallway and listened. No voice, no footsteps. Only the faint hum of the elevator cables and the muffled sound of a television above. I walked back to the table and opened my voice recorder and practiced the script again. The words felt less like a line and more like a shield. The hours dissolved into small squares of action and small circles of breath. I changed my direct deposit to the new account. I moved personal folders to a private cloud. I exported contacts and archived texts. I wrapped 2 framed photos in sweaters and left the other walls bare. When the sun dropped and the rooms turned blue, I sat beside the suitcase and placed my hand on the zipper. My hand shook. The tremor climbed to my shoulder and then eased as my breathing found its pace again. Time was tight. The letters were in motion. The calls kept trying to push through. The bank appointment loomed like carved stone. Yet the ticket was purchased, the funds were safe, and the new job was real. I had the documents, the plan, and a friend who would pull to the curb with coffee and the heater running. I stood and tested the weight of the suitcase and closed the small lock. The click was small and final. Fear moved under my skin like a cold current, and then settled. In its place was resolve, cleaned of panic. I was ready to leave before anyone could press a pen into my hand. Chapter 9. My mother sent a time and called it a family meeting. I forwarded the message to David and he told me to go only if I felt safe, to stay in common areas, and to leave if anyone raised a hand or a threat. I drove to my parents' house at dusk, the suitcase for San Francisco already packed by my door at home. Cars lined the curb. Inside, the living room had been rearranged, chairs in a circle and the coffee table pushed aside. Pastor Williams stood by the fireplace. Uncle Roger and Aunt Cheryl hovered near the cookies. Cousin Stephanie sat very straight with a folder and her badge from First Mountain Credit Union. Michael paced near the window. Jessica sat on the edge of the sofa. Ethan was not there. My father cleared his throat and said we were here to talk sense. My mother smiled, a tight smile. Pastor began about duty and bearing one another's burdens, about families that put away pride. I let the words pass. Stephanie opened her folder and said the credit union had an appointment set for Thursday. She said a cosigner often helped students and that my name in the draft was a placeholder to speed processing. Michael nodded as if that settled it. I said I wanted to show them something. I set my laptop on the side table and mirrored the screen to the television. A page appeared with the heading Access Log and a timestamp from Tuesday evening, the same night as the dinner. The line showed bonus detail and the username that accessed it. Lisa Moore. I said that entry was not mine, that HR had opened a trace, and that this was how my bonus amount appeared in the dining room, like a secret no one should have known. My mother pressed a knuckle to her mouth. Roger frowned. Cheryl stared at the carpet. I clicked to the next file. Screenshots of a group chat filled the screen. Names in the corner. Michael, Mum, Dad. Lines about a Tuesday dinner. A plan to present papers and keep it calm. A note that the banker cousin would help push it through. A sentence from my mother that said, Emily does not say no when we are all in the room. The silence thickened. Jessica began to cry. Michael told her to stop. Stephanie went pale and said she had only offered to answer general questions, that the bank could not proceed without a willing adult, and that consent could not be presumed. She closed her folder. I advanced to the next document. 2 credit card statements, balances circled, $12,900 on one, $9,800 on the other, cash advances near Colfax, and a gas station by their house. I said these came from inside the family and that the math matched the requested number with a cushion to spare. Michael said I was invading his privacy and trying to smear him. He looked for allies and found none. I said I had one more file. I pressed the space bar. My voice filled the room from a call last week, steady and low. His voice followed, fast and certain. He said the loan would wipe the cards, cover a personal note, and leave enough to make a show for Ethan so people would stop asking questions. He said the bank cared only about a signature that looked good on paper. He told me to stop being difficult and act like family. The recording ended. The room held its breath. Jessica covered her face. Pastor looked at his hands. My father stared at the blank television. My mother whispered impossible. No one moved. I said, Colorado allows one party to record a conversation. I said I had recorded a call to protect myself. I said I was not here to argue church or gossip or the words selfish daughter on a bulletin board. I was here to be plain. I would not sign a loan. I would not accept calls to my workplace. Any future contact about my employment would go to counsel. Any person who used Ethan as leverage would be documented and reported. Michael took one step toward me and stopped when my father lifted his hand without looking at him. Stephanie said the credit union would not hold the appointment without a consenting co-signer and that the meeting should be considered cancelled. She placed her card on the table and folded her hands. Pastor tried again about sacrifice and humility. I told him, humility is not surrender to a false story, and forgiveness does not require funding a lie. He had no answer. Jessica whispered that she was sorry and that she should have spoken sooner. She looked at Michael and looked away. My mother began to cry, in a sound that was more fear than grief. She said people would talk and that we could handle this inside the family. My father finally met my eyes and looked very old. He did not speak. I closed the laptop and pulled a small paper from my bag. It listed the numbers for my attorney, for HR, and for building security. I set it on the coffee table. I said I was instituting no contact for 6 months starting now. Any necessary communication about legal or financial matters would go through counsel. I would not respond to texts, calls, or third-party messages from church or neighbours. I wished health and safety to everyone in the room. Michael said I was destroying the family. Roger muttered that I would regret this when Ethan had questions. Cheryl said time would soften me. Pastor reached for a verse and found none. My mother called my name the way she had when I was a child. My father sank back and stared at the space where the television glare had been. I picked up my bag. Jessica half stood and then sat again. Stephanie watched me without speaking. I walked to the door. The porch air was cold and smelled like wood smoke. Behind me the voices rose and fell, like a radio between stations. In the car, I sat with my hands on the wheel and let my breath slow. Streetlights pooled on the pavement. The house behind me became a small square of light. The documents had done their work. The recording had said what needed to be said. The choice was complete. I started the engine, pulled away from the curb, and did not look back. Chapter 10. 3 months later, I woke to fog stretching past my window and the low sound of the bay carrying through the Embarcadero. I had moved out of corporate housing and into a small apartment on a quiet block in North Beach, where the street smelled like coffee and bread in the mornings. I walked to work with a jacket zipped to my chin and watched the city shake sleep from its shoulders. The San Francisco office buzzed in a way that made me feel awake, even on days when the sky stayed grey until afternoon. The new team folded me in quickly. My desk looked out toward a sliver of water and a tangle of streetcar wires. I learned names and projects, and the way the elevators hesitated at certain floors. The compliance audit I had promised to support turned into a full rebuild of a dataset that did not behave. The work barely left room for worry. There were meetings where I explained logic and outliers, afternoons where I wrote documentation as clean as glass, and quiet nights when I carried a laptop home, but never opened it because the city asked me to come outside. I ran on the path by the piers and felt the wind drag at my sleeves. On weekends, Ellie dragged me to a tiny gallery in the Mission. Caitlin taught me which bakeries had lines worth the wait, and Eric insisted on a ridiculous trivia night in North Beach, where we lost by a mile and still laughed until our stomachs hurt. The life I built there was not dramatic, which is why it worked. I learned the coffee cart guy's name, and he learned mine. I kept the small plant Margaret had given me on the windowsill and watched it lean toward the light. When I walked past a storefront mirror, I saw a woman whose jaw had unclenched and whose eyes watched the world without flinching. Sometimes I caught myself searching the sidewalk for old worries and felt surprised when there were none. News from Colorado arrived in slow, careful drips, most of it through Jessica, and some of it through the quiet network that always exists around a church. Michael lost his job after too many missed shifts and a performance review that dared him to grow up. Friends who used to cheer him on began to step back. He told a story about me that sounded polished and simple, and still people drifted away. Jessica moved in with her sister across town, and Ethan settled into a room with a blue lamp and a stack of library books. Jessica met with a counselor and then a lawyer. Separation papers were being drafted. Her texts were short and factual, and sometimes ended with a thank you that read like an exhale. As for the church, the message board went quiet. Pastor Williams stopped hinting from the pulpit. A woman from the choir wrote me a short apology without asking anything in return. My mother and father found that sympathy in a congregation drains fast when facts replace rumor. They kept attending services, but their names no longer opened doors. No contact held like a calm wall. My attorney forwarded a single reply to his letter that promised to keep my workplace out of family conversations. There were no more calls to HR. A month after I arrived in California, company security emailed to confirm that the benefits portal had been accessed from an internal account and that the account holder no longer worked in any system that touched employee data. The note was dry and procedural, and it felt like a page closing. I thought about Ethan often. while I waited for the next step to make itself clear. One evening I stood on the pier with a paper cup, cooling my hands, and watched the ferries cut across the water. I imagined him sitting at a desk with a math worksheet and a dull pencil that needed sharpening. It felt wrong to leave him floating in the wake of adults who had treated his future like a prop. So I opened an education fund at a bank in California with a trustee structure that did not allow access by Michael or my parents. I wrote the rules on paper and in the account documents. Distributions only to a school or to a program that listed its accreditation and sent an invoice. Monthly statements shared with Jessica and with me. A small automatic contribution that I could increase each year if the budget allowed. No cash withdrawals for anyone. I wrote a letter to Ethan to be opened when he turned 18. I told him he was loved, that work is a long game, and that numbers can be used to build a life rather than bury one. On a clear Saturday, I called Jessica and asked her to meet me halfway, between towns at a diner, with a parking lot big enough for boys to run in circles. She brought Ethan with a backpack of action figures. We sat in a booth near the window and drank coffee while Ethan built a city out of sugar packets. I slid a paper across to her with the account information and the rules written in simple lines. She read each sentence slowly. Her shoulders settled as if someone had lifted a barbell from them. She said she would keep the records neat and that she understood the boundaries. Ethan returned with a grin and showed us a tiny tower he had balanced on a napkin. Jessica told him the tower looked sturdy and I felt something unspool inside my chest and float away. After that day, the noise in my head dropped a few more degrees. I started to sleep through the night without waking at 2 to check my phone for phantom calls. When I dreamed, I did not stand in my parents' kitchen or sit at their long maple table. I dreamed about the hill above Coit Tower, or the curve of the bay, or the click of my apartment door, when I turned the key after a long walk. In the office, I did not jump when my name came up in a meeting. I sat straight and spoke in sentences that did not apologize for existing. My manager asked if I would lead a training for new analysts in the fall, and I heard myself say yes before fear could cross the room. There were still small aches. A song in a grocery store caught me off guard because Mum used to hum it while she cooked. A boy on a scooter made me think about Ethan at that age and about the way my father once steadied the seat of my bike and then let go. Some memories arrived with sharp edges and then softened as they passed. Others stayed sharp and I let them be. I did not have to sand everything down to move forward. I only had to hold to the line I had drawn. I walked the Embarcadero one evening when the fog pulled back and left the bridge etched against a violet sky. I thought about the amount my brother had demanded and the way everyone had called it a college fund. I thought about a number that had been held over my head like a verdict. I realized I had escaped more than a loan of $80,000. I had escaped the cycle of being used. I had stepped out of a room where my life was always someone else's solution and into a life that was my own. That night I cooked pasta with too much garlic and laughed when the smoke alarm gave a half-hearted chirp. I set the plate on the windowsill and ate, while the city lights blinked and faded and blinked again. The plant leaned its small leaves toward the glass. My phone buzzed and it was a photo from Rachel of the airport drop-off sign, where she had waited the night I left. Under it, she had typed one line that said, "Worth it." I set the phone down and let the room be quiet. If you have ever felt a family hand in your pocket or a voice telling you to carry a weight that is not yours, I am wondering how you handled it. Would you have signed to keep the peace, or would you have drawn a line and kept it?